Great, so welcome everybody. Thank you very much for joining us this evening on Thursday's half an hour webinar. And tonight I'm delighted to be joined by my colleague Peter Dean, Finance Director at RDA UK. I should introduce myself as well at this point. I'm Caroline Ward, Head of Communication and Insight for RDA UK. So the usual bit of housekeeping, we will be aiming to go for 30 minutes. So Peter will be asked to wrap up if the subject just gets too much and we're all carrying on taking too long. And if you've got questions, please do pop them in the chat and I will try and keep a record of those. And if we have a chance towards the end, we'll go through some of those questions. You might notice I've also populated the chat with a few links there, which Peter has kindly given me ahead of time, which are some sort of further information links plus Peter's email address. So take a note of those if you want. And obviously, this webinar will be available to watch again, and you can also contact Peter at any time for any more support on this area. So without further ado, I'm going to kick off by just asking you, Peter, if I may, can you just set the scene and just tell us broadly really what we mean by reserves?
Yeah, thanks, Caroline. Well, a very useful definition of reserves, which I have found just in kind of preparing for this. So reserves being the funds that a charity will use to cover expenditure to buy some time in the event of reduced income or a change of circumstances. So I like that little phrase that we use reserves, generally speaking, to buy us some time so that we can adapt to problems or opportunities that have come up. So simple example, so obviously lockdown, so when all RDA groups had to stop operating, certainly those groups that had or have got fixed costs, so they own horses, or the larger groups if they own a centre, employ staff, etc., they will have needed reserves in order to cover that period. Similarly, you know, on a less extreme level, if a group does own horses, so if the loss of a horse that needs to be replaced or a large vet's bill, these are all examples of when reserves are needed. I've also jotted down pretty much all groups will need reserves just for working capital. So income and expenditure doesn't usually happen at the same time. So it might be that a smaller group's main fundraising event is held at Christmas, but then their costs of the RDA sessions will obviously be spread throughout the year. So it's just kind of a timing thing that some reserves will need to be held. The calculation of reserves, again, kind of a definition. So it's freely available funds. So we can exclude from the calculation of our reserves what we're talking about. We can exclude things like fixed assets. So the larger groups or centres, in case of lockdown or large unexpected bills, we can't easily sell land or buildings or equipment or horses. So those things are excluded from the calculation of reserves. Similarly, restricted funds are also excluded. This is according to the Charity Commission. So restricted funds being generally donations that have been given where the donor specifies this donation can only be used for a certain purpose. so the donation is restricted to that purpose, or if we set up some kind of fundraising appeal. So at the start of the pandemic, RDA UK set up a fundraising appeal saying that we are raising funds specifically to support RDA groups throughout the UK. So funds which we received were restricted for that purpose because of the way that we worded our appeal. So that's a little bit on the calculation. I feel like I'm kind of rushing through. Final point on this, on kind of the introductory kind of area. Reserves are sometimes expressed in terms of the number of months of normal expenditure that they would cover. So going back to the definition about buying some time, how much time do we need to buy? So if our annual expenditure is £120,000, i.e. an average £10,000 a year, how many months, if we think we need 3 months cover, then that's, you know, £30,000 reserves. Reserves are also often expressed in terms of not just, well, we're going to aim to have 3 months worth of reserves or £30,000 in reserve. They're often expressed in terms of a range. So we will aim to hold 3 to 6 months worth of reserves at the year end. In general, the higher a group's fixed costs, the higher their reserves will be required. So again, kind of an example, a small group that may not own anything, may not own any even horses, but they go along to their local centre where they're based, hire the horses when they're needed. Their income and expenditure may be £5,000 per year. Potentially their only fixed cost is the membership and insurance charged by National Office, but charged by RDA UK. So they may have a policy of, well, we'll aim to hold £1,000 in the bank at the end of each year, just for that working capital kind of aspect. So that's, in one sense, fairly simple. At the other end of the scale, larger RDA groups, centres that own their own property, own their own horses, employ staff, and they've got higher fixed cost commitments. And so, other things being equal, I would expect their reserves policy to be something like, say, if their income and expenditure is £250,000 per annum, there might be a policy of, well, we're going to aim to hold round about 12 months worth of operating costs, so £250,000, or a range 9 to 12 months, something like that, just because if unexpected things happen, they need to buy themselves more time because they've got higher fixed commitments. That was a long answer to the first question.
No, that's great. So I think from what you're saying, it's not true then that the RDA UK or that the Charity Commission even, they don't tell groups what their reserves should be then?
No, absolutely not. No, this is a myth which I have heard a few times during my time at RDA. Certainly RDA itself, RDA UK, doesn't stipulate what reserves a group should hold. I think where the myth has arisen is that when we're doing a grants to groups round, what we do say is that grants are unlikely to be awarded to groups that hold more than 2 years worth of operating cost. That doesn't mean that we are saying you should hold 2 years of operating costs, because we recognise just from the examples I've just given that, again, other things being equal, smaller groups might well hold quite low level of reserves, and that would be appropriate in their circumstances, whereas larger groups with higher fixed cost commitments will need to hold higher level of reserves. So we acknowledge that. We think if a group, even the larger groups, if they hold more than 2 years of running costs, that might be appropriate in their circumstance, but it's unlikely that we would award a grant in the grants to groups round. So really the RDA UK advice and guidance is to follow the Charity Commission guidance, and the Charity Commission specifically say that all charities must have a reserves policy. So all charities, large and small, must work out each group of trustees, not just the treasurer, not just the treasurer's responsibility. Each group of trustees must have a reserves policy. And I'm just going to read something from the Charity Commission, some of the reasons for that, some of the benefits of having a reserves policy. It helps to explain to funders, donors and beneficiaries exactly where the charity stands. It gives confidence in the resilience and financial management of that charity, and it sets out future funding needs. So it can actually be used within the whole kind of fundraising area to say this is, so going back to our large centre, if their considered reserves policy is that they aim to hold £250,000 reserves at the end of the year, if they haven't got that level of reserves, then that can be used as part of fundraising when discussing with funders. Well, gosh, you've got £150,000 in the bank, but the group will be able to explain, well, yes, but our reserves policy is this. This is why our reserves policy says we need a higher amount. It's not that we're fundraising to put the money in reserves, but we want to be a resilient charity for ultimately for our beneficiaries, our riders and our drivers, both now and in the future. These are our fixed costs, these are our calculations, and hopefully funders will engage with that kind of discussion.
Thanks, that's really interesting. We've had a couple of questions through. Thank you, Kate Bennett. Thank you, David Holmes. David picking up that I think some of the advice that we give on our website could perhaps be clearer about the 2 years of reserves issue. And Kate is asking about, is there a maximum reserve that RDA National considers correct? And I think what I'm sort of hearing from you is that it's a difficult one for us to be totally black and white about. Would that be fair? Yes, it is. It isn't rocket science, and I don't even know if it's a science. It's definitely part science, part art, and it depends on the circumstances that the group finds itself in. I know that I've had discussions with groups whereby they hold some reserves in case their venue closes, and there may be costs associated with moving to a new venue, and
and that to me, that's a definite grey area, because it really does depend on the individual circumstances of the group, their relationship with the centre where they're based. You know, it comes down to the thoughts, motivations, dreams, and retirement plans of the centre owners in some cases. So I wouldn't necessarily advocate holding reserves in case we need to move venue, but in some cases it would be appropriate.
And I think that this brings up something which I think is quite interesting about this. And you said before, you know, this isn't just an a subject which is for treasurers, because this seems to me to get really at the heart of what trustees are, some of the difficult conversations trustees are having to have about sort of balancing risk and also their aspirations as a group and what they want to do. So how does a group sort of navigate and balance in those conversations that the trustees are having between the activities they want to be able to do to support their beneficiaries now and making sure they feel secure to do the same for participants in the future? Yeah,
I mean, it is I'm pretty sure it's a trustee, sorry, it's a charity commission, at least guidance, if not requirements, that trustees balance the needs of current beneficiaries and future beneficiaries. So so for current beneficiaries could potentially be saying to the charity, well, you need to spend more now. We don't want reserves to be very high at all because it's all about us now. Whereas if future beneficiaries had a say, and this is probably why the Charity Commission gets involved, because future beneficiaries don't have a say at the moment, they will be saying, well, don't spend too much now, you need to build up your reserves. I'm going to use that phrase about resilience again. You need to make sure that the RDA group, the charity, is resilient for the future, such that when we, you know, in a few years' time, when we, these future beneficiaries, need the service, you are still there, you are still operating, you have enough money in the bank to keep going ultimately. Yeah, I think that was on that point. That's the balance. We've got a question in from Pam. Thank you very much, Pam. This is the technical question. I've got no idea whether I'm throwing Peter a curveball here. So we'll just see if there is an answer to this. So Pam says, if land is leased, can they hold reinstatement costs as part of their reserves? I'm pretty sure the answer to that is yes. I didn't want to get too much into the technical elements of funds, but I would suggest that kind of thing would be appropriate to be held in a designated fund. So as distinct from a restricted fund, but if trustees decide that of the unrestricted funds which they hold, an element should be earmarked, ring-fenced for a specific purpose, then be clear about that in the accounts. That's called a designated fund. So rather than it being the donor's decision that it's being restricted, it's the trustees deciding to designate that particular amount for a specific future purpose. Designated funds are also excluded from the calculation of free reserves. It is possible to undesignate designated funds. We're getting way too technical. I didn't want to get this much technical, but since the question was asked.
No, that's great. Thank you, Peter, and I hope that that's useful to you, Pam. There's joyfully, I'm getting a few questions in, Peter, and I'm just thinking. One of the things I know you wanted to cover is what groups do if they feel their reserves are too low or too high.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
This.
should we just have a look at that now, and then if you just bear in mind that I've got probably a couple of quite, you know, good questions to finish off, so we've got time to get to those.
So the at the end of the year end, when we produce our accounts, we need to say what our reserves policy is. So our reserves policy is we will aim to hold between 3 and 6 months worth of operating expenditure in reserve. As likely as not, the actual reserves might well be outside of that range for a variety of reasons, whether that's COVID or an unexpected legacy towards the year end. So if our actual reserves are lower than our reserves policy, what do we do? Well, it's either a case of it's very similar to my household expenditure. I'd like to have a certain amount in the bank at any particular point in time. I haven't got enough money, so therefore we get together and say, well, is there any way of increasing income, or is there any way of cutting expenditure? In an RDA group context, increasing income by developing a different strand of fundraising, maybe. That's a whole separate webinar. The thought of reviewing, and I know definitely one group who I was speaking with recently, reviewing their charging policy for the charges to riders and drivers, and over a period of time increasing those charges. Similarly, are there areas where we can cut expenditure, whether that's short term or long term, and groups themselves will be best placed to know where that might be possible. So that's if our actual reserves are below our reserves policy. If our actual reserves are higher than our reserves policy, again, we need to, although we might think, oh, that's a nice problem to have, we need to think carefully about this. Ideally, or potentially, can we expand our services, which will probably incur greater cost and kind of bring our actual reserves down? Could we subsidise our current beneficiaries, maybe for a time-limited period, more than we currently do? It's the danger of having reserves which are too high. It becomes more difficult to fundraise because funders will say, well, you've just got enough money. Why are you applying to us for a grant? Ultimately, there may be some kind of reputation risk within the local community that the group serves, or even a wider RDA family risk. I think ultimately the Charity Commission can get interested and get involved, but initially it's a case of explaining in the accounts, this is our reserves policy, these are our actual reserves, this is what we're going to do about it to bring actual reserves back in line with our reserves policy. Thank you for giving me a chance to go on to go through those points. Great. Let's have a look at some of the questions.
So I've just got 3 final things I'd just like to go through. So Valerie is just asking for some advice on investing reserves, please.
Oh gosh. Well, going back to one of the definitions, that the reserves that we're actually talking about are the freely available funds. we can't tie up our reserves too much. So putting them in an account. Are there still bank accounts that pay interest these days? There might be some out there. In the good old days when the interest was a thing that we could earn. So tying the reserves we're talking about up in an account that you need to give 6 months access kind of starts to defeat the object of having freely available reserves. If you've got restricted reserves or designated funds, then that might be appropriate. Certainly thinking about the lease question earlier, that might be something. Well, we know we need to hold these funds. We're not going to need them for 5 years. Yes, it's fine to tie them up, kind of thing. Investing. When people ask me about investing, there's few places to go to get any decent interest. Obviously, larger groups with larger funds might feel it's appropriate to kind of risk the stock market, some kind of stock market, and there are investments specifically made for charities, where you can kind of dip your toe into I can't remember the name of the common investment funds, I think, something like that, specifically for charities. But that's I'm certainly not going to start advising groups to go down that line.
No, that's great, thank you. And this one, I think, to that point, actually, Iona Brown says, we expect to need to start buying horses in the near future, and would like to ring fence reserves for this. Is there a time limit on how long they can ring fence that money for?
Technically, no, there isn't a time limit. If a designated fund, a ring-fenced fund, is appearing in set of accounts for years on end, it seems like, well, why has it been set up? Why not undesignate it? But for that purpose, it's a good reason to ring fence some funds to set up a designated fund for that purpose. Absolutely. So there isn't a time limit, no.
Great, thank you. And we all know that I think that groups need to be very agile and move very quickly when it comes to horse purchasing, don't they? So that sort of free availability of those funds is actually very important.
Yeah.
Final question then, I think, just looking at the clock. Thank you from Anne, who says, we do not note reserves in our accounts, so we do have quite a lot of money in the bank, which, and I think she's saying, which in the view of trustees, that means there's no point applying for grants, possibly RDA UK grants, or possibly just wider in general. Please advise, he says.
Okay, I mean, if it sounds as though, again, depending on the circumstances and the amounts involved, etc., it might be that is a group that has their actual reserves are higher than their reserves policy, noting that all charities need to have a reserves policy. If you haven't got a reserves policy, pop it on the agenda for the next trustee meeting. So really going back to what I was saying, it's how can we use, I'm going to use the word excess, that's not really correct, but how can we use excess funds that we have got above what we think we need to keep in reserves? So can we expand into to do one more session a week or whatever? There was a and finding difficulty in fundraising, that sounds like that may be the case. So final thought, by all means talk to us, talk to RDA UK about ideas, possibly regional teams as well, who will know the local area and the specifics.
Having promised that was our last question, I've got one from Claire here, which is I think it's quite straightforward, but it's a good question, which is, should different funds, ring fence, designated, etc., be held in separate accounts? No need for that. It's an accounting separation. Everything can be lumped in the same bank account. There's no need to hold them in separate accounts. That was a nice, easy question to finish on. Well, I was hoping that was something that would just draw us to a close nicely. One of the things that's that really striking me about this is this has been a very targeted webinar, really great number of people coming forward and some really good questions. And it strikes me this is something that is an area of interest, and also an area where there's quite a lot of things which people have got questions about. So I would also say that those of you watching, you know, you've heard Peter, you've got his email address there in the chat. If this is an area which has kind of whetted your appetite for finding out more, and you think actually there's a really good conversation you could be having with your trustees, then do please get in touch with us, get in touch with Peter. Lean on us for answering some of those questions and helping to guide your trustees through what is obviously actually quite a difficult topic, because you know, it's all about people's different views on risk and you know, and your ambitions for the group. So we're going to leave it there, but I'd just like to say thank you so much to Peter for taking the time to talk us through some of that this evening, and thank you all very much for tuning in. To what was a really interesting session, and I learned a lot, so thank you very much, Peter. Thank you everybody who has joined us. Goodbye.